mysterious and diminutive children of the forest, and they were gifted with many supernatural powers. It's unknown how long the children lived in Westeros, or even where they came from, but the oldest records that we have available relate to the arrival of the first men on the continent from Essos, and this was about 12,000 years ago. They called this time the Dawn Age. The first men crossed into what we know now as Dawn from the eastern continent using a land bridge that connected the two continents together called the Arm of Dawn. As the first men spread throughout the land, they built their holdfasts, they cut down the sacred trees and burned them, and this basically infuriated the children of the forest who worshipped the trees. This forced them to declare war on the first men, and ultimately it led to a war between the first men and the children of the forest. After years of warfare, before they fought one another to a standstill, the two sides eventually agreed to a truce, and they signed a pact on the Isle of Faces, agreeing to peacefully coexist, and they granted the open lands to humanity and the forests to the children. A notable event that took place during the war is when the Greenseers of the children used dark magic to make the seas rise, and they swept away the land that connected Essos to Westeros. But it was too late, because the first men of Westeros had already immigrated across, and went on until the pact was established. This was the beginning of the Age of Heroes, and it was a time when there was a lot of legendary kings and heroes who walked the earth, and you probably know quite a few of them. There was Bran the Builder, who built the wall and built Winterfell. There was Lann the Clever, who swindled Casterly Rock from the Casterlys. There was Garth Greenhand, who was the ancestor of House Garden of the Reach, and Joran, who was the founder of House Durrandon, the first of the Storm Kings. The pact lasted for 4,000 years before a race of apparent demons called the Others emerged from the uttermost north of Westeros, from the polar regions of the Land of Always Winter. They wielded razor-thin swords of ice that could cut through steel, and they could raise wights to fight the living. The children of the forest and their allies, the First Men, fought violently against them, but they were eventually driven southwards by their advance. The first members of the Night's Watch were able to drive the others back into what eventually became the Battle for the Dawn, which marked the end of the Long Night. After the Long Night ended, steps were taken to ensure that the people would never be caught off guard by an invasion from the north again. Bran the Builder supposedly raised the wall, an imposing structure of solid ice and magic stretching 100 leagues from the Gorge in the west to the Shivering Sea in the east, and this was cutting the Land of Always Winter off from the remainder of Westeros. So apart from in the recent events, there has only ever been one previous appearance from the White Walkers, which was a story about the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He fell in love with a woman with skin as white as the moon and eyes like blue stars. He chased her and loved her, though her skin was as cold as ice. And when he gave her his seed, he gave her his soul. He dubbed himself the Night's King and brought her back to the Night Fort, which was one of the castles, that belonged to the Night's Watch. During the dark years of his reign, horrific atrocities were committed, including sacrifices to the Others. So this was very much akin to what was happening at Craster's Keep. It was not until Brandon the Breaker, who was the King of Winter, and Joramun, who was the King beyond the Wall, joined forces that the Night's King was eventually brought down and the Night's Watch was freed again. Now then, if you're still with me, fast forward 8,000 years to the current setting, and in recent times we've seen a host of events with appearances from many different White Walkers and even the Night King himself. In Season 6, we were given an extremely significant flashback of how the Night King was made, but nowhere does it ever state exactly when this was, just that the children of the forest did it because they were being slaughtered by the First Men. Now, before the pact was made, there was not a single mention of the Night King or the Others being used as a direct weapon by the children of the forest. What if this was because not long after, And by that I mean, what if it was pretty much immediately after they created him, the Night King just completely lost his shit and turned against them? I mean, looking at his power, could they really have stopped him if their experiment went south? His only limitation, as far as we can see, is that at the time he was just one man, or just, one White Walker. There is surely no way that they could have anticipated what would have happened when they put that dragon glass through his heart, or even how they would expect him to listen to them, let alone fight for them against his very own people. My guess is that some nasty shit went down, and they were forced to leave what is now known as the Land of Always Winter. Looking back at when they first made him, there was no snow on the ground, so the Land of Always Winter at a point was not winter. It must have been known as something else before this time. So the children flee, and they've got no choice but to run south, and it's at this point they realise that if they don't make a pact with men, that when the wrath of the Night King resurfaces, that they would not be able to deal with him alone. When the pact was agreed, they made no mention of him to the First Men, and their choosing to turn a blind eye is definitely what resulted in the Long Night. They let 4,000 years pass. Maybe they thought the Night King wouldn't live that long, or that, he would remain in the Land of Always Winter, but either way, they were wrong. The most worrying thing to me is that during the Long Night, they obviously, were never able to properly defeat the Night King, only to beat him back. They built that wall with Bran the Builder because they knew a time would come when the Night King would return. So why is it that it seems only a handful of the children remained north of the wall? Well, there's your answer. Because they're not north of the wall, they're south of the wall, and they're still hiding back on the Isle of the Faces, otherwise known as the God's Eye. I very much liken this location to the great Awa tree that we see in Avatar. The Na'vi see it as such an important and sacred location. One thing that has me pumped is that there was a recent photo leak that managed to snap the supposed title for episode 6, and it was called The Big Tree. If there is, a version of Awa, then of course this is where they're still going to be, and it would be where Bran needs to get to, especially if it would act as some kind of, network or a hub, or maybe to even amplify his Greenseer abilities. When the children of the forest first made this pact, why, of all the places, did they decide to do it on the God's Eye? They knew they had to protect that particular location. Their links to fire, to ice, and to Greenseers all seem to either have been taught or passed through to pockets of the First Men. But it looks as though the Night King was able to take the strongest of their abilities and more. He's immortal, he can reanimate the dead, walk through fire, and he is a pure embodiment of ice created with frozen fire. But with his great power, there is equally enormous suffering. A being that was once a man of flesh and warmth and love with a true purpose of life, now he only knows an eternal life that is meaningless, cold, and unfulfilling, created to be used as a weapon of war. The Night King wants to meet his maker, and he will never stop until he rids the world of the very evil that created him, the children of the forest. This symbol was his message to the First Men and the children of the forest, that he remembers what happened here all those thousands of years ago, and he will have his retribution.